Well, there's no more disturbing aspect of the UFO phenomenon than the stories about the men in black. Words such as creepy, eerie have been used to describe them, and when they appear, their effect on their targets is quite chilling. And now you can add the women in black to this mysterious phenomenon. Nick is a full-time author and journalist specializing in a wide range of unsolved mysteries. The Men in Black and Women in Black are two, and he's written 5 books on the subject. In fact, on all things UFO and paranormal related, Nick has written at last count about 60 books. He joins us now. Hello, Nick.
Hey, Dean. How's it going?
Pretty good. Going to talk about a subject that really sends a shiver up a lot of people's spines, the Men in Black. And a couple of questions to start with. Who are they, and are they from the government?
Well, personally, I don't think they are from the government. I think this is one case or one phenomenon, if you like, that we can't sort of place at the foot of the Pentagon or the government or any government. And I'll explain why that is. Now, if you ask most people outside of ufology who are the Men in Black, they'll probably say Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones. And the reason being because the movies were so popular. They raked in millions upon millions of dollars all around the world. And what the movies did was to demonstrate to people outside of ufology. I mean, everybody within ufology had heard of the Men in Black, but the movies really presented the MIB to a worldwide audience. And, if you ask anybody pretty much who has no interest in UFOs, who are the Men in Black, people will say something like, oh, those are those guys who silence people who've seen UFOs. So everybody knows about them. But the movies, as entertaining and as fun as they were, they actually presented a scenario different to reality. And by that, I mean that in the movies, the agents work for this secret agency within the government that goes out and silences people who've seen UFOs. However, if you speak to the vast majority of all the witnesses to the Men in Black, they actually describe something very different. Namely, that the Men in Black don't actually appear to be wholly human, in the sense that people describe them as being extremely skinny, sometimes extremely tall. Their skin is sort of like the color of a bottle of milk. It looks like they're on the verge of final stages of anemia or something like that. Mm-hmm. And very often they wear these sunglasses, which are kind of weird in the sense that they look like a cross between sunglasses and ski goggles. And people have realized that when they got close to the Men in Black, or vice versa, they could see that they got these large bulging eyes hidden behind the glasses, as if they were trying to camouflage their appearances. And they also do that by wearing these old style fedora hats, which they pull down over their face as well. So when you think about it like that, it's not surprising that many people, witnesses and people in ufology, have come to the conclusion that the real Men in Black are actually a kind of alien human hybrid type entity that is nothing to do with the government, but there's still the same scenario that the Men in Black, whether human or extraterrestrial or paranormal, their goal is to silence people who've had UFO activity.
So how long have they been around, and what's their modus operandi?
Okay. Well, although the so-called modern era of ufology began in 1947 with the famous Kenneth Arnold case of seeing a squadron of UFOs, strange-looking aircraft, over Mount Rainier in Washington State, that's when the whole thing relating to UFOs began, as I said, in what we call today the modern era, even though it is actually 70 years plus now since it all happened. But what's particularly intriguing is that apart from just one or two very kind of scant and scarce cases, the whole phenomenon of the Men in Black didn't actually begin until the early 1950s. We're talking about 3 or 4 years after Kenneth Arnold made the term flying saucer famous. And it really began with a guy named Albert Bender. And Albert Bender lived in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And after the Second World War was over, Bender moved into his stepfather's home and rented out the attic room of the house. And the house that he lived in was kind of like a creepy old house, sort of like Norman Bates's house in Psycho.
Yep.
Sort of, the sort of classic creepy old house on the hill, that kind of thing. And Albert Bender was an intriguing character because he sort of really gravitated to the UFO phenomenon when it all kicked off in 1947. And by the time the early 50s came around, he decided to create his own UFO investigative group, which was called the International Flying Saucer Bureau. And he also put together a newsletter which he would send out regularly to subscribers all around the world. For example, he had fans and followers in Australia, New Zealand, the UK, the US, of course, where he was based, parts of South America, and so on. And he ran the IFSB for a couple of years, put out the journal for a couple of years as well. And then suddenly he quit ufology. And people were like, well, why is he quitting at the height of his research? And it turns out that at the height of his research, late one night when he was in his attic room, he started to feel ill and sick and dizzy and weak, and it felt like he was going to pass out. He laid down on the bed, and suddenly the room was overwhelmed by this overpowering odor of sulfur or brimstone, which is a sort of classic aspect of the supernatural, never mind just ufology. And he said that 3 men appeared in his room, and by appeared, I mean, he said they sort of literally materialized through the doors and the walls without opening them. And he described them as wearing black suits, skinny black ties, white shirts, black fedoras, and they had these white shining eyes. And he claimed that they warned him telepathically to leave the UFO subject alone or else. And Bender, in this sort of semi-passing out state, essentially at that point at least, he decided or told them he would leave the subject alone. And then they just dematerialized in front of him. Now, this went on for several days and weeks, where he would see the men in black sort of following him late at night. One example, he went Saturday night to a local cinema, walking home, saw these 2 men in black sort of carefully shadowing him, and then they too just sort of vanished into nothing. Now, it's important to note that Bender was also deeply involved in the occult, and he spent a lot of time at what he called his paranormal altar in the attic, where he tried to, he performed rituals and rites to try and perform rituals to try and bring in entities from other forms of reality, if you like, dimensions. And that may be exactly what happened, that he actually really did open a doorway or a portal that allowed these MIB through. So it's kind of ironic that everybody thinks the MIB are from the government or a government, but the reality is that the very first guy who started the MIB mystery had encounters that had nothing whatsoever to do with the government.
Yeah.
And he shared the story with a friend of his, Gray Barker. Barker was a journalist, a writer, editor, and also worked in the film industry. And he saw the dollar value of Bender's story. And so he wrote a book in '56 called They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers. And that was the very first book written on the Men in Black. So that's how it all began, with Albert Bender's experiences, and then Gray Barker spreading the story throughout the UFO community with his book.